Well, in my backyard, there's literally thousands of these. This is an acorn. And what's fascinating about an acorn is the fullness of an oak tree, but its origin is something so small. And what has to happen for this acorn to become the oak tree is it's got to go into the ground and be planted. And when that seed takes root, it all of a sudden bursts forth with life. And so I say that because that is what the book of Genesis is. That a lot of people, when we think about Genesis, we think about like cute little stories we tell our kids and whittle them down into moral imperatives to try to teach a moral lesson. And yet the reality of it is, as you read through the storyline of the scriptures, what you end up seeing is that every theme, every narrative, every covenant, every promise, everything that God is after throughout the entire storyline in Scripture, culminating with the cross and then coming to full fruition in eternity, begins with Genesis. That the book of Genesis is this small little acorn that goes into the ground. But when you begin to understand its themes, its promises, its narrative, it is the origin of the great oak tree of our scriptures. It's a world about a God creating the world with potential and fullness, and he's inviting his image bearer to co-create with him this great narrative. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look deeply into the story of Genesis to see the origins and the introductions. And so for this session, we're going to be really looking at the first 3 verses. And the idea is to help us reorient our minds really to not how we read Genesis in the 21st century with these little moral imperatives and good little cute stories that we tell our kids, but rather what they were meant to do, which was reframe our mind and reorient our lives around the reality of who God is. Because the story of Genesis is not just some story. It is the opening act of the great story that leads throughout the rest of our scriptures. And so let's dive in to the book of Genesis. Now, as you first approach Genesis, the first thing you have to recognize is kind of the overarching breakdown. And so simply put, Genesis breaks into 2 major parts. You have the origins of the universe, and then you have the origins of God's people. So you have the universal focus in chapters 1 through 11, and then in chapters 12 through 50, you have the national focus of the Hebrew people beginning with Abraham. And so another way to look at that is you have 4 events and 4 people. The 4 events are creation, fall, flood, and Tower of Babel. And then the 4 people are Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph. Now, though the line that will lead to Jesus goes through Judah, the narrative focuses in on Joseph. And so that is the overarching breakdown of the book of Genesis. And what Genesis is there to do is to reset our view of God. You see, the original audience was not us. The Bible is not written to you. It's written for you. It's written for your benefit. But it was written to a real people living in a real time, wrestling with real situations. And so the more we understand how they viewed the world, the more we'll understand the worldview of the scriptures. Because Genesis, the creation account, is not about creation. We need to stop reading it like a 21st century kind of post-enlightenment individual, but rather read it the way the initial Hebrews would have heard it. Because when you do, you realize the book of Genesis and creation is not about creation, but rather it's fundamentally about the God of creation. It's about the God who moves into darkness and creates light, moves into chaos and creates order, moves into the void and creates fullness and potential for his image bearers. That is what the creation narrative is about. You see, if you read through all of Genesis 1, you're going to see the word creation 5 different times. And so kind of Bible study 101, whenever you're reading through the biblical narrative, whenever you see things repeated, you know it's important. And so 5 times in one chapter is actually a lot. But it's nothing in comparison to how many times the name God is mentioned. Where creation is mentioned 5 times, the name God is mentioned 32 times. Once again, creation is not about creation. Creation is about the God of creation. And so the way we need to think about Genesis 1 specifically is that it's more of a canvas that we get to see the character of God. That's what creation is all about. You can tell a lot about an artist by the art they create. And that's what we see in the story of creation. And so the story of creation is going to first and foremost kind of shine a light on who is this God. And what we're going to see is that he is fundamentally different than any other earthly king or pagan so-called God. And we see that in the opening lines. So let me read it, and then we're going to unpack like every word and see what they would have seen. So let me begin by reading Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light.' And there was light." So those three verses are all we're going to look at in this session. But as we do so, we're going to reorient our minds to not only how the Hebrews would have understood those verses, but how we can now understand the God who wrote these verses. So if the question is, who is this God? The first thing that we see is that he is singular and powerful. So right off the bat, it says, "In the beginning, God created." So what's already happening is for the original hearers, they are being reoriented back to who God actually is. And so the original hearers were the Hebrews that had been recently freed from Egypt. And so let's just kind of put ourselves in the minds of the original Hebrews. They had been living under oppression and slavery for over 400 years. That's longer than America has been America. So the first thing we need to wrap our minds around is the reality of the prevailing mythology of the day that was surrounding the Hebrew people. The ancient pagan creation accounts, for example, featured a world that was created out of violence, sexual perversion, or oppression. So just to kind of give an example of this, there was one ancient account in which two gods literally were having a fight with each other, and then one god ripped the other in two, and that's how we got the sky and the ocean. There was another account in which the moon was a product of rape between the sun god and the earth god. There was still another account in which the gods had essentially created humanity to do the work they didn't want to do. Which is why so much in the ancient world there were certain types of sacrifices and rituals that they had to do, not to show honor to God or not to walk in sanctification and holiness before God, but kind of placate the gods so that the gods wouldn't mess with them. And so pause for a second. Think of living in that world. That is the air you breathe. That's the socioeconomics of your day. That's the culture. That's what you talk about in the marketplace. That's everything around you. A world that's marked by wild violence. When you look out on the oceans or the sky, you see violence. Someone that was ripped in two to make that happen. And when you look around at like the moon at night, you don't see this beautiful array of stars and celestial bodies. You see sexual perversion. And then when you just look at your own life, you go, man, I just exist to perform before the gods and to kind of placate them and to make sure that they either ignore me or make sure that they will shower favor on me. And the only way I'm going to do that is I got to work in order to win their approval. Now, what's tragic is that many of us, we think that God actual is that type of God. Like, there's so many people that still think that God is this God of violence or this God of, has this like weird view of sexuality, or a God that you just have to placate your life before and perform in order to win his approval and acceptance. And what Genesis is doing to the original audiences and to us is reorienting our minds to help us with the reality that that is not the God who is, but that was the culture that they lived in. And not only was it the theological culture that they lived in, but it was the national culture that they lived in. The original audience, again, were the people that had recently been freed by Egypt after 400 years of oppression. And so their entire livelihood was subservient to Pharaoh. They were slaves. Every day a week, wake up, produce, make bricks, go home to your little hut with all the other slaves, go to sleep, wake up again. That was their life. So their entire identity and self-worth was whittled down to this, a brick, what they could produce for almighty Egypt and almighty Pharaoh, who also thought he was a god. And so pause for a second. Think of the world that they were living in. A world that was marked by sexual perversion, a world that was marked by violence, and a world that basically looked at you and said, you exist to perform, to produce, so that the gods will be okay with you and Pharaoh won't kill you. That was the world they lived in. And let's be honest, it's not that far removed from the world we live in. So the original audience needed this, and so do we. And that's why it says, in the beginning, God, singular. Literally the word Elohim, in which there's not this pantheon of gods, but there's one God. And that God is Creator God. And we're going to see how he creates. It's not through violence. It's not through sexual perversion. And we're going to see why he creates. It's not so that his little people would just be slaves to him and perform before him. But it's something radically different, that we get to be introduced to the God actual, to the God who is. So the first thing we see about him is that he's singular. There is none like him. And the second thing we see about him is that he's sovereign over the threefold universe. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the ancient Hebrews, when they thought of the universe, they thought about it in three layers. So let's do a little bit of an exercise together. Right here it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So I want you to think about what comes to your mind when you think about heavens. A lot of us probably initially think of something like clouds or maybe like a sky palace or something like that. That's a product of the culture that we live in. Or next, what do you think about when you think about Earth? My hunch is that what comes to your mind is what comes to my mind, which is a globe. It's that picture taken by the astronauts as they came back and they saw the totality of the Earth in all of its beauty and splendor and glory. That's not what the original Hebrews thought about. You see, the word heavens and earth also means sky and land. And then when you look down in verse 2, at the end of it, it talks about waters. Sky, land, waters. That was the threefold universe that the original audience lived in. That's how they understood the world that they lived in. Sky above, land below, and then waters both around them and below them. You dig far enough, you hit water. So there was three different levels of heaven in the Hebrew mindset. And again, don't think sky palace, but rather think sky, think air, think wind. And so the first level was just the air around you, the air you breathe. The second level was the air above you. And so you walk outside and you're in a field with no concrete or buildings or things like that. And you just kind of look up and you look around. And what you would see is what looks like a giant dome above you. That's what the second level of heaven in their mindset was. The third level is what we would think of as God's space, where God dwells, the heavens. And so in the beginning, God created the heavens, the sky, the dome that's around them, and the air that they breathe. And then it says he also created the earth. Now, when we think earth, again, I think a lot of us think about like a globe. But for them, it wasn't a globe. They hadn't seen that. They hadn't sent a rocket into space and looked back at themselves. And so when they heard earth, they saw earth, the land that was around them. And so the last one was the sea, the waters. The waters was both around them and below them. You dig far enough and you put a well in there and there's water that comes out of that. And so in their worldview, what you had was the heavens above, the earth below, and the waters around. And that right there, we're told that God is the one who created that. He is one who created the heavens and the earth. So now we see the reality that God is singular and he sits supreme over the entire universe. So now the question then remains, what would God do with this power, with this might? And what we see him doing is three distinct things as the story progresses. The first thing he's going to do is he's going to take the formlessness and void and bring fullness and life. It says in verse 2, the earth was without form and void. Literally the Hebrew words tohu vavohu. Now you don't need to remember those, but those are fun words. Tohu vavohu, formless and void, without form and without life. And what we actually see in the days of creation that we'll talk about in a later session is that God takes the first 3 days to address the formlessness. He takes the formlessness and creates form. And then he takes the next 3 days, days 4, 5, and 6, and he takes the void and he creates life. And we're going to look at that in a later session and see how that was actually a Hebrew poem that showcased the God of creation, and his creative work was a poem that he, as Aslan did, sang creation into being. More on that later. So the first thing he does is takes formlessness and void and brings form and life. The second thing he does is he moves into chaos and creates order. Now, where do I get that? Well, I want to do another exercise with us. I want you to think about, close your eyes, and think about what comes to your mind when you think about nothing. What comes to your mind when you think about nothing or nothingness? You got something? I'm pretty sure it's something. We live in a world of somethings. And so even the question, what comes to your mind when you think about nothing, something populates your mind. And so for some of us, it might be like a dark room, like one of those rooms you've been in which you literally can't even see your hand in front of your face. Or for some of us, if we're more like artistically minded, it is a blank canvas, a black canvas that's just ready to be painted. Or for others, if you're like myself, you think of like the emptiness of space, just the black void that's out there, the nothingness that's out there. And yet, what comes to our mind when we think about nothing is in fact something. And yet, if I were to do the same exercise with the ancient Hebrews, they wouldn't have thought of anything that we just thought of. Definitely not the night sky. Because when they walked out in the night sky, they saw brilliance and beauties and stars and so many things. What they would have collectively thought about was one singular thing: dark, chaotic waters. To the ancient Hebrew, when they looked out at the endless ocean and the abyss, what they saw was darkness and danger. Darkness and danger. They saw nothingness, and it terrified them. Every ancient pagan account about creation features waters. It was the terror of the ancient world. And as we already saw, one of the ancient accounts had to do with two gods fighting and one of them ripping the other in two and saying, well, there's your waters and there's your sky. And so not only did the ancient world look at the waters and see darkness and danger, they saw violence. And yet, with that in mind, let me read to you verse 2, and to see what God is doing in the midst of all this. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And so think about now what the Hebrews would have just heard. They would have not have heard about some violent God who's creating the universe, but rather a God who sees darkness and danger and doesn't move away from it. But did you notice? Moves towards it, moves towards the darkness, moves towards the chaos and creates order, moves towards the nothingness and creates something. It says that the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the water. That word hovering is used elsewhere in Scripture to talk about how a mother bird would hover over its nest. And so this God who's Elohim, who's sovereign over the threefold universe, is using that power to do what? To bring fullness out of something that was formless, to bring life out of something that was void, and right here to bring order out of that which was chaotic, moving into the darkness and hovering over it with all of its protection. And so the last thing that he does is he speaks. And by speaking, he turns darkness into light. It says in verse 3, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. No cosmic battle, no grand fight, no sexual perversion, no violence, no oppression, but rather the powerful God speaking, and it comes into existence. And so we see in these opening verses a God that takes formlessness and makes it formed, takes void and makes it life, takes chaos and makes it order, and right here takes darkness and simply speaks and says, let there be light, and there was light. That is how God is introducing himself to humanity. That is how God is reintroducing himself to the Hebrew people. And so we have seen who God is. He is singular and he is sovereign. But we've also seen what he does with that he moves into chaos, creates order, moves into darkness, creates light, moves into the formlessness and creates form and order and life. And now we get a glimpse into why he's doing it. It's because this God who is all-powerful is at his very nature a God who is love. Now, where do I see that? Well, we see in the first 3 verses of Genesis what will be clearly revealed in the person of Jesus Christ, that our God is both singular yet plural. One God, but 3 persons, Father, Son, and Spirit, and they're all present in these verses. So what we see here is God, the Father, is the one speaking. The Spirit is the one hovering. And the Son is the one proceeding from the Father in his spoken word. The Father speaking, the Spirit hovering, and the Son being pushed forth into creation. And it was the Father, Son, and Spirit that before they said, let there be light, were united in one essence as God, equal in the divinity of God, and yet distinct in person and role. And we see the first glimmerings of our triune God in the very beginning of creation. Again, creation's not about creation. It's about the God of creation. And so what we've just seen is, yes, as the theologians would say, God has created ex nihilo, out of nothing. That's how he created. But we see here that he also created ex amore, out of love. That's why he created. That he is a God of love. God is love. And out of that overabundance of love, God moves into darkness and creates light, moves into chaos and creates order, moves into the void and creates life and fullness. That is the God of creation. And that very God has made himself known to us through the storyline of Scripture, culminating in the person of Jesus Christ. That Jesus was the one who turned darkness into light. John 1:1 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. We also see that Jesus sits supreme over the 3-tiered creation. The heavens, the earth, and what's under the earth or around the earth, water. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 9, it says, therefore God highly exalted him and bestowed on him a name that is above every name, so that the name of Jesus every knee should bow. Where? in heaven and on earth and under the earth. And every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. Jesus sits supreme over the three-tiered universe. And lastly, what we see is just like the Spirit hovered over the face of the waters, bringing order out of chaos, calmness out of chaos. What we see is that Jesus does the same thing. He walks into the storm of this world, of our world, and in an actual storm in Matthew 14. That if you remember the story, Jesus' disciples are in a boat and a storm is hitting them over and over and over again, and they think they're going to die. But then it says in verse 25 of Matthew 14, and in the fourth watch of the night, chaotic, dark waters, he came to them. He moved towards them, walking on the sea. Jesus is hovering over the face of the waters, walking on them in the same way that the Spirit was hovering over the face of the waters. And so what we see is that these opening verses in Genesis are only the beginning taste of the fullness that we ultimately see in Jesus Christ. The storyline is about him. He is the God of creation, but he is also the God of recreation. He is the one that comes into the storms of our lives and creates order. He's the one that comes into the darkness of our sin and creates light. He's the one that comes into the void and creates fullness and life. That is the God of creation.